Welcome back from lunch. That wasn't too open-ended, was it? Lunch was good, right? Yeah. And you're charged by that little piece of chocolate thing in there? Yeah. Okay. Good. Our catering crew are awesome. We'll have a chance to thank them at the end of the day. So we have our second practice roundtable coming up with a phenomenal group of presenters, each of whom is doing super interesting culture-relevant work within their organization. We'll start with Hilda West, who's the VP of Talent and Culture at Clorox. Welcome, Hilda.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here. It's been a great day so far, and last night's dinner was wonderful, so thanks to Jenny and Samir for pulling this together and inviting me to speak to you all today. I'm going to talk to you about our journey to shift culture at Clorox, and I'll give you a heads up. I'm not going to talk about how we've assessed our progress, really, because we're using pretty standard approach, and I have a feeling my fellow panelists will have more exciting things to say on that front than I will. So we're using surveys, pre and post, and that sort of thing. So, but I think we do have an interesting story to tell. I will say we're on a journey. We're not there yet. We're nowhere close to being able to call this success yet. But it's been an interesting journey, and I think we're taking a somewhat unique approach. So that's what I wanted to share. So most people, when you hear Clorox, you think bleach. And that's for good reason, because, of course, that was our flagship product when the company was founded over 100 years ago. And not in a garage in Silicon Valley, contrary to what some of you might be thinking. Actually, 5 miles down the road here in a general store in downtown Oakland. So we were all about bleach 100 years ago, but today we're about much more. And so we have a very broad portfolio of brands, Burt's Bees, Brita, Glad, et cetera. And more recently, we've been moving into the health and wellness space. So we are a global company. We like to call ourselves the small big company or the big small company because we're not that big, $6 billion in sales, 8,800 employees, but we box above our weight because the companies that we compete against are much, much bigger than we are. Procter & Gamble, S.C. Johnson, et cetera. Let's keep going. So the other thing that I want to share is we're in good shape. Like, we are a Glassdoor best place to work. We have employee engagement that benchmarks higher than high-performing companies externally. We get awards for our diversity, et cetera, all the time. So that's all great. So why am I here talking about shifting our culture? It's actually makes it a bigger challenge. It's a bit of a dilemma that we have because we have a strong culture, and as Jenny informed us, 3 years ago tomorrow, by the way, that having a strong culture that is not aligned with your strategy is actually harder to change than if you just have a weak culture. And Clorox has a strong culture which in many ways works really well for us, but in some ways is not strategically aligned. And the reason is, for 100 years, we gave our shareholders great returns by executional excellence and adherence to really great processes. And we have smart people, great people, really nice people, respectful, that come into work intending to do all the right things, but we get so stuck in some of our outdated, I would say, processes and focus on execution rather than focus on innovation or creativity that in this external environment we're in today, that's a problem. Does that make sense? Okay. So what have we done? What has been our journey? We decided we wanted to drive creativity. Oh, no. Creativity, innovation, curiosity, experimentation in the organization. And we didn't want to do that with the standard top-down, HR-led approach. Now, that may work really well for some other companies, but we felt like we needed to present an approach that felt like the direction we wanted to take the company. And so, we titled our program Be Bold. We wanted to have one thing for the company to focus on. We talked about a lot of things. We need to be more consumer-oriented. We need to have employees act like owners, et cetera. In the end, what we did, which was interesting and very effective, was to kick this off, we brought together a group of 18 very diverse people from all corners of the organization. We had long-tenured people, brand-new people, people from marketing, people from sales. The common denominator, every kind of diversity in this group of 18. And I didn't know almost any of them when we first pulled this team together. And by the way, I didn't lead this by myself. I led it with a VP, very seasoned VP of marketing, who's in the room with us today, Doug Milliken. And so it wasn't just an HR program. We had this diverse group of employees. We pulled them together. The only common denominator was they're all high-performing people who were influential in their worlds, and they were motivated to make change at Clorox. So we pulled these folks together, and it was actually pretty amazing. We gave them some grounding. They didn't know any more about culture than any employee would working in any kind of company. But we did bring Jenny in day one and have her give us just a couple of hours of grounding of what culture is and what it takes to change it. So let's see. I'm going to keep going. So one of the big things that we did with this group of 18 people was we decided we needed a catalyst event. And rather than a training program that we were going to start with the executive leadership team and cascade down, we did a program called Bold Week. And we put a large percentage of our employees through this program, which was very experiential. It was not a training program, but it gave them an opportunity to stretch their comfort zones and practice new skills and really be out there. I mean, we had people in crazy costumes, but they were really trying to learn about what it is to be creative and fail and give each other feedback. And so there was a lot of incredible learnings, and that was sort of the foundation for our culture change. And the other interesting thing I would say about this group of these teams that we took through was they were large teams, like 25 to 30 people. So there were actually groups of maybe 2 or 3 smaller teams or more together. But they all work towards a common goal. So they might be all on the Glad brand, for example, but some are on food storage and some are on garbage and et cetera. So, but they had at the very high level a common goal. So we did that intentionally because we wanted both junior and senior people to go through this experience together. And that was a way of building accountability for each other. Like if I see my senior leader being uncomfortable, failing, trying new things in front of me and committing to this new bold behaviors, then I, as a junior employee, feel comfortable maybe walking into that executive's office and saying, hey, I think we should be doing things differently. Let me be bold here. We got that a lot. I'm now ignoring you. So we got through, that was sort of our foundational work, and we got the bulk of the company in, and I do believe we really did shift people's behaviors and norms in the organization. But we knew all along that was not going to be enough, and that in order to really change the culture, you also have to focus on how you operate day to day, as well as structure. And so right now, we are focusing on how we operate day to day. And to drive change in how we operate, I mean, if you think about it, someone could come in all charged up to be bold at work, and then they're faced with some process that's like overly complex and burdensome and old school, and that just does not feel bold to them. So it's really hard to sustain that new behavior. So now we're starting to look at these processes very carefully, and we're picking one, again, focus on one, and the one we're choosing is decision-making. And the way we're trying to change that is by working with business teams in the course of their business to question the way that they're making decisions. We have a box of tools that we provide for them, but really, it's really about them reflecting on how they make decisions and starting to make them differently. So that's our focus on how we will operate differently. And this was part of a strategic initiative. The good news is we have a CEO who believes that culture is a strategic resource and is super supportive, as is the executive team. And so we have a new strategy out this past September, and this is one of the key pillars: reimagine how we work, simpler, faster, bolder. And we're leveraging this to drive more simplicity in the workplace and speed. So I'll end with, there he is, time is up. I'll end with just a few learnings that we had from this journey. Number one, starting with this diverse team of employees from all corners of the organization was super powerful, because not only did they bring great ideas and fresh thinking, but they were ambassadors for us once they rolled off the program, and that was great. Focusing on one thing was powerful. Like, we believe employees, we jam so much at them, cybersecurity and, program goals and, and then here's a new culture program. So we really felt like focusing on one thing was very important. And I guess the final thing I'll share is the focus on making sure our programs feel the way that we want to drive the culture to be. So I do believe we've taken this entrepreneurial approach. I was really thrilled by Jay's presentation coming right before mine, because it reinforced for us that even though we're not there and every day feels like a struggle, 2 steps forward, 1 back, so far, so good. Thank you.
I'll just advance it once I don't have slides. Oh, do you? Oh, do I go or? Okay. But you don't have to. Okay. Okay, hello everybody. I am Mary Kate, and I am here from Google. And it is so exciting to be here. I cannot tell you. I was so excited to come to this conference that on Monday, I ran into my partner Maria at work, and I said, Maria, I'm so excited to go to Google. I was so excited to go to Berkeley with you on Wednesday. And she says, and I get this ping from her on Tuesday. She's like, so tomorrow's your birthday? And I said, no, why makes you think it's my birthday? She says, well, because you were so excited to go to celebrate your birthday with me. I said, I'm so excited to go to Berkeley. She heard, I'm so excited to celebrate my birthday. That is how excited I was to come here today. So this is actually my academic motherland. Thank you, Jenny, for inviting me back. And I have been, since graduating with my PhD from this program at Google, and that is really what I'm here to talk to you about today, is some of the work I've been doing at Google. And I want to tell you about one of the absolutely most exciting, newest, coolest technologies that we have for understanding culture. Now, before I do, I kind of want to see where we are in the baseline for this room of people. So how many people here have heard of Google? All right, yes, I don't have to go into that. Okay, next, how many of you have heard about Google's culture? Great, I can skip that part. All right, last part, how many of you have read about Google's culture recently? All right, good, I don't want to talk about that either. All right, so, but I do want to talk about this technology we have. So I imagine you're thinking, oh, Google must be machine learning. We must use your Gmail, and we must use Calendar, and we must use the ambient noise collected from your cell phones and put it all into an algorithm, and then it must go to a robot who fixes everything. But sadly, that is not what it is. It's called a survey. Has anybody heard of a survey? Well, I love a good survey, and I want to talk a little bit about them because I think they're really overlooked. I think they're absolutely fundamental, and they're actually really some of the most important cultural machinery we have at Google. So my team at Google is within People Analytics, and what we do is we listen to Googlers at scale. And what does that mean? It means that we're at all times assessing aspects of our culture, aspects of our company experiences, and trying to understand how we can do better. And how do we do that? We do that through surveys. Our team runs 16 different surveys through 73 different launches, to over 500,000 invitees a year. 500,000 invitees, but you only have 1 employees. Yeah, the math doesn't work, because we also actually survey people who apply to join the company and don't even get in. That's how enthusiastic we are about surveys at Google. You don't even have to be a Googler. We still bother you to take them. We do all aspects of the employee life cycle, from when you apply all the way until when you decide to leave. We look at key moments like when you change roles, when you change locations, when you're changing managers, and 5 minutes, sorry, okay. And how we look at all of that to really understand the employee experience. And there are a couple of fundamental reasons why these are so important, and I want to just go through them very quickly. The first is that actually a lot of the academic research that was going on when I was here at Berkeley looked at power. Now, what does power do to people? What we know about power is that it creates some circuits in our minds. And when we become powerful, it becomes much, much harder for us to make good decisions. We become more rash in our decision making. We make decisions that are less good because we're greedier. We get greedier. And it gets a lot harder to understand other people's perspectives. That makes it really hard for our leadership, as they're making these fundamental decisions about our culture, to understand the effects that will have on the average Googler. And that is what we're here to solve. I read this amazing paper last year, and it was about perspective taking. I don't know if any of you have read it, but essentially the way it worked out is they asked a bunch of people in all sorts of contexts, 25 different experiments, and they said, imagine that you have to solve this puzzle or provide this perspective. Think about how the other person in the situation would feel and give the best perspective. Which do you think did better? Those who just answered the question, or those who tried to think about how others would feel and then answer the question? Yeah, that's what I thought too. Others, right? No, not at all. If you tell someone to think about how others feel, they do worse. 25 experiments, every single one. It was very consistent. People do worse. Why? Because it doesn't matter if you're trying to think about how others feel, if you don't know how others feel. It's not about perspective taking, it's about perspective giving. And how do we gain perspective? How do we gain it rather than take it? And that is really where the power of solid cultural assessment, data, and surveys lies. The other thing we know about power is that it's not a friend to accountability. And surveys are a very powerful way of providing a check on those who are powerful. Accountability produces critical thinking. It makes people look for the best of all the possible answers rather than the single one that they think is best. And so both accountability and perspective gaining are two of the most powerful ways that surveys, I know they're old, they're boring, and they're old-fashioned, but they really are so powerful within our culture to understanding how people are feeling, how they're reacting, and how we can really make the culture work for them. And so with that, I'll wrap up, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have about surveys.
I forget the clicker. I'm Chantrelle. I'm from Microsoft, and I've been at Microsoft just over 4 years. And the reason I came to Microsoft is because they acquired the startup I was working for. We were a venture-backed tech startup, and we were one of about 20 companies that Microsoft acquired that year. And they continue to acquire a lot of companies, both as a business strategy and also as part of their culture change strategy. And I'm from the Seattle area where Microsoft is headquartered, and also Amazon. And when we were approached about the acquisition by Microsoft, I was very apprehensive. And that was based on experience that I'd had. I'd never been a full-time employee of Microsoft, but I'd been there multiple times as a consultant. And I had not had a positive experience with the culture. There are a lot of words you could use about the culture. One of the ones that Microsoft itself is using a lot is to say that we had a know-it-all culture. And I think it was like 10 years ago, so I don't know if the word was invented, but if you had asked me, name one word to sum up the culture, and I had known the word mansplaining, that's probably the word I would have used. I was mansplained to on a regular basis when I was there. But when the acquisition came closer and I started to think harder about it because it was going to be real, I started to pay more attention and realized that I think we were just like under a year into the tenure of our third ever CEO in the history of Microsoft, named Satya Nadella, and he was making the as far as I can tell, his top priority to refresh the culture, to evolve the culture of Microsoft. And so I thought, well, that sounds like a hard job. And as someone who's really fascinated by culture, that'll be interesting to see just how that goes, even if it can't succeed. And then I realized, of course, you can't. That's not how good culture works, is with people sitting back and watching and be like, see how that goes. Everyone has to be an owner of the culture. And I started to become a lot more optimistic because I started to think, well, not only was the startup that I was working for and the product that we were working on a really cool opportunity for Microsoft, but also that what we were doing was part of the new way that Microsoft wanted to operate. Instead of being know-it-alls, instead of listening to the highest paid person in the room or the person who was the smartest person in their class and never forgot about it, or the loudest, or the person who throws chairs, we were going to look at the data and see what the data said, and we were going to bring more information. And that's what my startup was working on. We were working on using signals that are generated when you do your work to understand how work gets done, how people behave in organizations, and just try to translate all of this into facts. And you heard from Jeff and from Ethan this morning about what this kind of signal looks like. And just to give you some examples, we prioritize privacy first and try to make sure that this is all de-identified data, that it's aggregated to a level where no individual person's data is looked at. And then we have fun with how much you can do with this data. So if you look at the signals that are automatically generated when people are using their collaboration tools like email, calendar, chat, and documents, you can understand how they use their time. So you can understand, what are they spending their time doing? Are they meeting? And the most meeting country is Jamaica. And the most email country is the United States. So are they in meetings? Are they sending messages? And what does their time profile of their day look like? Like, do they have solid chunks of time to do work, or is it fragmented? Are they working long hours after hours? And then when they're doing that collaboration time, who are they collaborating with? So what are all of their relationships? How big is their network? How fast is it growing? How diverse is it across different categories like demographics and function and seniority in the organization? How much time do they spend with their manager? And how innovative is their network? How likely are they to have access to different diverse perspectives around the organization? The network itself, you can look at the density and the structural holes in the network and who are all the bridging connectors between all the different areas of the network. You can look at processes. We have obviously an enormous amount of privacy to work with when we are looking at words, but when you have the ability to analyze words, you can understand what type of business processes people are engaging in. And so we look a lot at how much time does the budgeting take, how often do people talk about safety, like we were talking about yesterday. Like, all these things are really interesting to the businesses, and you can map out how they stretch across the whole organization. And you can look at relationships outside the business too, because you can look at everyone's customer relationships if they're doing kind of like a B2B sales organization. And how does that correlate with how happy those customers are or how much money they spend with their company? And not just customer relationships, but anyone else who you're communicating with using these tools outside of the business, including your supply chain and your contractors, like we were talking about a lot yesterday. And an interesting one that we just looked at recently was your relationships with academia. And we were looking at companies that were ranked as innovative companies versus companies that were very similar to them but were not ranked as innovative. And you can argue about the definition of innovation just as much as you can argue about the definition of culture. But But the companies that were ranked as innovative, on average, had about 25% more ties with academia than the companies that were similar to them but not ranked as innovative. So we do a lot of, this is a product that Microsoft customers have access to, and a lot of them are now using. And we also do a lot of work inside Microsoft on Microsoft's own culture transformation. And so I just brought 2 quick examples of that. And Microsoft is an engineering culture. We have like 50,000 salespeople, probably as many as we do engineers, but we are an engineering culture for sure. And if you ask engineers, what's your biggest problem, what could make you more productive, they'll say, get all of these meetings off of my calendar. I want to sit by myself and write code. And that's fine. Like, that's true for a lot of companies that feel like they have a massive collaboration overload problem, and they are unproductive because too much time is sunk in meetings. And we're working with I think it's like a Fortune 100 pharma company whose new CEO is saying, we want a 50% reduction in meeting time because this is making us really inefficient. We're paralyzed. We can't make decisions. So that's great for a lot of companies want this, but at Microsoft, that's not the strategy. What we need, like our values include being one Microsoft, everyone working together from across our gigantic company, and also being customer obsessed, which means you need to go talk to your customers. So all these engineers whose natural, normal human tendency might have been to go and shut themselves alone in their office, they need to be in these meetings so that they're all working together and they're all understanding the giant complexity of these like world scale systems that they're building. So instead, so then their next choice is, well, how about if we defragment our calendars? Can we build it so if you are old enough to remember, like, you used to be able to go to your computer and tell it to defragment, and then it would have this really satisfying thing where it would, all these little squares would get less, and then your computer would probably run faster. You felt like it did. Anyway, they wanted to take the calendar and just reorganize everyone's week so that everyone had the maximum amount of time to focus. And I thought nobody would ever want that. And they built it in a hackathon, and they wanted it, but we never did ship that as like, it would just reschedule all your meetings for you with the algorithm. But this is just a business process. This is a quarterly meeting that the leadership team can have to say, what's our rhythm of business, and how do we sync everyone up so that we're intentionally giving people as much blocks of focus time as we can. And then another thing that we ship is a personal set of analytics that help you to make decisions about, like, do you have all your time next week is booking up? Would you like to reserve the few focus blocks of time that you have left? So another thing that engineers like to do when they're writing code is to be shut up in their own private office where it's quiet and no one will bother them. And Microsoft, for I guess like 40 years of the rest of their history, has had that be our physical workspace, was everyone had their own private office with a door. And part of the culture change, like this is one of the tangible things that we're changing about the culture, is we're getting rid of that and people are working in open workspaces. And people are pissed off. They do not like it at all. And some people do, but like it's part of the culture change. People need to work together. If you sit by yourself and write a really beautiful, code up a really beautiful feature for your product, that might feel really good and you have your flow time and you feel very engaged in your work, but chances are really good that a dozen other people have written the same feature, and the company would be better off if you had contributed to their work. So we take everybody and we put them in rooms together, and they have to work in that style. And then we also change the performance management system. So we're one of those companies now that doesn't have performance ratings. For years we had stack ranked performance ratings where in every team there was a forced curve, and so every manager had to pick from among their team the top person and the bottom person, and they were compensated and kind of given their self-worth accordingly, which meant your team wasn't a team, right? Like the best thing to do in that circumstance was to try to be the smartest person in the room, because that was how you would get ahead. So it was a foundation of this toxic culture. And so they've changed it. Now we don't have performance ratings, but we have a structured kind of performance conversation system. And there's equal weight given. There's a 3-piece Venn diagram. There's equal weight given to how much did you contribute personally? What was the impact of your contributions? And how much did you contribute to the success of others? And the third one is, what did you do that built on the work of somebody else? So get out of your office, come to the meeting and sit there and understand deeply other people's work and then make their work better. That's teamwork, and that's that instantiation of the culture in all of our different systems and processes. And so we use data about who's working together to lay out this workspace and to monitor what's happening differently when people move into these shared workspaces. And it turns out that when you co-locate people, you save time them walking to and from meetings, and that's nice because we're in a hurry and we're humans and we all have to go to the bathroom in between meetings, and if you don't like being late and everyone's saying you're sorry and everyone's rushing all the time, like that's a bad experience throughout your day. But also it turns out when you put people closer to the people that they work with, they spontaneously start having more meetings, like they're doing more work together and they're becoming more collaborative. So that's the goal. And we do a lot, like, so this is all really fun data. This is a product and a growing product area for Microsoft, and it's also just a great thing to study. And so we work with academics, and we are really happy to share data when we can. We have to talk to lawyers a lot to do it. It takes some time, but we like to publish our own results. So we have individual companies, we have very large data sets across all these companies, and then we have our own Microsoft people who love to be part of studies. So we have, we're glad to talk about that. We have some of my colleagues in the room too, if you'd like to talk to them. I'm all done.
Thank you. Nice job. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jenny and Samir, for creating this environment for us to be sharing so many cool ideas. And second time here, it just keeps getting better. And thank you for extending as well into all the collaborative research and the projects in between these. So it's really a pleasure to be here. So my name is Jeremiah Lee. I'm with a firm called Spencer Stuart. We're an executive search firm. I'm based in Boston. And I'm joined here by a number of other members from Spencer Stuart, so hopefully I'll represent the diversity, but there's some really interesting people here doing CEO succession work and data science and management consulting and analytics, so please look up my team members between sessions. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on what we've learned in the work we've done in culture diagnostics and leadership assessment, kind of backwards looking. What we've learned, what we've found that works or doesn't work, but then a little bit of sharing some of the latest thinking around what we're moving towards next and what we'd like to collaborate around and some challenges we'd love to get your input on. For those of you who may not have heard of Spencer Stuart, for 60 years they focused primarily on executive placements. So particularly at the C-suite level, CEOs, executives and board directors. Only in the past 10, 15 years have they embarked on kind of a new leg of the journey, expanding into leadership advisory work and assessment. And that sort of began, actually, one of my colleagues, Bob Stark here, is actually, he lives right next door, and he was acquired about 10 years ago for the innovative assessment tool that his company had created. And so we've started focusing more on trying to evaluate the potential within executives and also help them to develop more. So that was kind of the first part of the journey. And maybe, another key component of that was when myself and my 3 other founding members were acquired for our firm's work on culture. And you might have seen we published some of the research that we did in 2018 in Harvard Business Review on this model and the research. And a kind of disclaimer is that while there are some incremental improvements, I think, in what we've added to the kind of the really good work that people have been sharing, it's not dramatically different. You'll see a lot of similarities. And in many ways, I think one of the things we did was try to integrate and simplify and strike a balance between rigor and pragmatism. And particularly in the context of executive placements, it was kind of interesting that when we joined the firm, Spencer Stuart, and I think the industry was just coming to terms with the fact that, surprise, surprise, when you place an executive, culture plays a big role in their success, right? And it's not to say that we didn't think about that before, but there wasn't enough science around it. So they brought in our toolkit, which was focused on evaluating company cultures, the environments that executives were joining, as well as the profiles and the preferences of individuals. So that was kind of the main thing we did. And this is kind of what it looks like. This is a picture of when we've diagnosed a culture, which is asking for perceptions from informants about the social norms in the company. You get a picture in this space of possibility on the current culture. And it's not just surveys, it's also interviews and content analysis and observation. So we take a multi-method approach. But then we also look at individuals within the organization, their preferences. There's two instruments, one framework, and you can then look at the difference between the two in the same space of possibilities. And then we have conversations about the future aspirational target. Where do we want to go? And that is not diagnosed. That is something that needs to be decided upon, similar to strategy. So looking back on kind of the work we've done, first of all, in joining Spencer Stuart, I think one advantage we've gained that some people were talking about yesterday is the problem of access. That it's really hard to get access to this level of the organization and to collect this kind of data. And in just a short amount of time, we've collected 30,000 profiles of executives and their preferences, and 600 organizations in terms of the environments. And that provides kind of unique advantage in finding patterns and all that. But I think another thing that we've seen is that even the field of culture diagnostics has evolved around certain key concepts like culture fit. When we first joined, culture fit was kind of everywhere in the field, and people were asking, can you help us to find executives who fit? And nowadays, that's kind of a no-no, right? That the notion of culture fit is quite controversial in a world where diversity and inclusiveness is really critical. And so more and more we're talking about how are these people culture adds, and how can we advise on their impact and their alignment? And even more importantly, how do they exhibit a culture adaptability? And that's where we're working with Samir and Amir and team around evaluating how people adjust to new cultures and adapt. So that's I think one important finding. Another thing is that more and more there's kind of pushback on survey methods, so that there's kind of a challenge around, is that sufficient? So we're looking for multi-method approaches to collect implicit data that augments our survey tools. I think another problem that we've experienced, particularly in businesses, I think academics may get it a bit better, is that culture is oftentimes treated kind of in isolation as distinct from other elements of the organization. And one of the things we try to do is broaden the picture to understand kind of the various other elements by which culture is expressed. So when we think about culture as social norms, pardon me, I'm going to have a quick drink of water. So if we think about culture as an expression of social norms, or in Edgar Schein's definition of artifact, values, and assumptions, in that sense, what isn't culture, right? Culture gets expressed through just about every aspect of the organization. And in the past couple of years, I've had the benefit of working with Henry Mintzberg and learning a lot from his thinking. And he's known for strategy work and structure work, but he talks about this phenomenon where ideals get kind of propagated in an organization, and the ideology becomes contaminated. He used the word contamination. And I like that term sort of as a proxy for culture. And the way he talks about ideals is very similar to social norms. So when the ideals propagate into the way that managers operate or the way that the structure is formed, those elements become culture. And it's a mutually self-reinforcing relationship. And so one of the things we do is look for the way that culture and norms get expressed into the structural forms and the management behaviors and how they come out of alignment. You know, the mistake of defining a leadership competency model independent of the culture and the values. So bringing together these connections and understanding how norms kind of seep into and contaminate or propagate in other aspects of the organization. I think another element that yesterday we talked a lot about, and somewhat today as well, is the macro versus micro, the multiple levels. So at the organization level, we're talking about the macro level of culture, how a division or how an enterprise culture can propagate. But those same norms are going to show up in the teams and the small groups, and there were people who focused on small group dynamics and kind of the micro or meso-cultural levels, and at the micro level of individuals. And so one of the things that we found is this is something that we're just beginning to apply a little bit more rigor to, is tracking how social norms can be kind of seen across those levels. So you see how an individual preference or value then gets propagated into a team norm that then gets kind of ripples out into the organizational culture, and vice versa, how organizational and macro dynamics constrain the individual preferences of individuals. And the same way in strategy, how an individual goal of an executive can then suddenly become the team mandate, which then ripples out into the organizational strategy. So it's quite critical to think about how culture and the forms propagate kind of horizontally across the different aspects of the business, and in this sense, vertically across the levels of analysis. The problem with that is it gets really complicated quickly, and when you're working with businesses and executives, time is usually one of the biggest constraints. And so we're always looking for kind of shorthand simplification, shortcuts to get at that. And again, working with Henry, I've learned quite a bit about his configurations. He has different forms that tend to be more frequent. They show up more often. And in looking at those archetypical forms, you can pick up on a unique form of an organization and look across those levels and across those domains and say, oh, that's a machine. That's like a machine. And in doing that, it gives you a shorthand for the way that the social norms have propagated into the way managers operate or the way that they've designed the organization. So one example that's pretty common, as organizations get really large, and there's somewhat of an evolutionary direction here. As they get very large, it's pretty natural with size and age and scale to bureaucratize, to become more like a machine. In that sense, you can pick up on that in that the leaders who are most fit for that archetype become planners. They're pragmatic, they optimize, and the culture becomes mechanistic and constrained. You can pick up on that in that the structure itself is characterized by behavior formalization, rule books, policies, programs, et cetera. Versus you can pick up, we've been hearing about a couple of organizations. Yesterday, people mentioned Elon Musk. Or earlier today in Pixar, the Ed Catmull, when a founding member is still around and kind of acting on a day-to-day basis in the organization, their identity and their choices become a big part of the culture and the form itself. That's more like a craft where the leader's a pilot and the structure takes the form of centralized decisions and the identity of the leader, his or herself. More and more we're hearing organizations that are interested in becoming agile, so we would call that the gig form. Characterized by adaptation, mutual adjustment, adaptation, and you'll also be able to pick it up in the structure of relationships. A number of people have talked about network analysis. You'll be able to characterize, for example, you'll see lots of dyadic relationships in a machine with a lot of structure holes across boundaries, versus in a gig you'll see lots of triadics, three-person connections, and lots of closure within teams. So the advantage of this is providing kind of a shorthand way to pick up on a cultural form as it propagates. So you can kind of see the social norms take shape in the way that the organization operates broadly. The last point I wanted to make is that beyond the assessment of cultures, there's this this ever-present question on how do you change a culture, and how do you, once you recognize a form, if I've recognized my company as a machine and I want to evolve it towards a gig, becoming more agile, becoming more flexible, how do you do that? And I think Michael Morris actually presented yesterday a very helpful framework of top-down versus bottom-up change, where top-down is starting with the institutional layer, which then becomes ideals and then is reflected in the practices and the kind of day-to-day work, versus bottom-up, which starts with practices and habits and then becomes ideals. One of our experiences in this, and I'd like to hear more from what you've experienced, is that it's hard to do it one way or the other. It's kind of a false choice in our view. And so one of the most successful ways we found culture change to work is starting at the top with CEOs who in and of themselves embody the institution itself. Their identity and the way they behave authentically becomes institutional. So you start with the CEO and the executive suite and shifting their behavior, but at the same time, simultaneously looking for new habits that you can experiment with. And in the middle, they both kind of reside in the ideals. Over time, if you see kind of a correspondence between the way that the institution itself, with the way executives operate and the way the new strategies and the new structures that they create, new operating models, if they correspond with the day-to-day practices, then suddenly people go, I guess this is legit. This is how we do things. This is normal. This is an ideal. And in that recognition of both the top-down institutional pressure and the bottoms-up new habits, I think that's the sweet spot. Is that you begin to recognize that this is a legitimate change, and people start to buy into that. So that's kind of what I want to share today. And thank you very much for having me here. And
invite the panelists to come back up. So this was another stellar group of talks. Thank you all for a really interesting, diverse set of company experiences. Let me start with the room and see what questions you all have. Yeah, Morton.
Yeah, terrific set of presentations. This is for Chantrelle and maybe also for Google. So you measure and do a lot to promote collaboration. That's one thing you said. Are you concerned with over-collaboration, the wrong kinds of collaboration, getting people to go to more meetings they shouldn't be in?
Yeah.
And how do you measure that? How do you track that? It might be more difficult to track than just the volume of collaboration.
Yeah, I'm personally, I don't stress about it, but companies do. Yeah, most of the companies that I work with are very concerned about over-collaboration and people wasting time and another useless status meeting. And they feel like part of their agile transformation is that every company is now doing is to leave behind some of the work, because it just kind of fossilizes in the organization and people keep doing this work that is no longer needed to be done. But to assess the quality of collaboration, like with just using data by itself, we use stuff like multitasking and the size of meetings, and then if you start to join in things like is the company, like, are quality decisions getting made, and what's the performance of the organization is always fairly difficult. But with a sales team or something, for example, you've often got a good amount of outcome data. And then most often it's joining it with survey data, because you have to get kind of both sides. And so often the top complaint on an employee engagement survey will be, this company can't move fast enough, or I'm always wasting my time in meetings and too much email, or like the work that I'm doing isn't effective because we're so bureaucratic. And so putting all that stuff back to understanding not just people say this, so therefore let's get rid of meetings, but people say this, therefore let's help them get rid of meetings, and then let's tell the story of, here's your top complaint, here are all the best ways that we can think of to do something about this, like this is a shared problem, and kind of move people from being victims of their calendar and all these tools that they have to being owners.
And do you sort of include continuous performance feedback loops? So if a manager seems to be running the wrong kinds of meetings, too many people and so on, do you sort of like give that feedback loop? And I wonder if, Mary-Kate, would you do the same in Google? Because you have all this data, but does it sort of get fed back to the managers who need to improve on kind of a timely basis?
Yeah, I can kind of add in a little bit of color there. So yes, the feedback, especially from our employee engagement survey, for example, gets sent out to every manager who has a certain end count, and all the way up the management chain. So certainly we try wherever possible to close that loop, and we close it not just with the recipient of the feedback, but with the givers of the feedback as well, so that they know how the data were used. I think on the point around over-collaboration, it's a very interesting one. I think we hear so much in Silicon Valley about collaboration, teamwork, but I think the other sides of that as autonomy and information. And so you need collaboration, but you also need autonomy. And you need the flip side of autonomy, which is you also need to know what's going on with everybody else. And I think if you can get all three of those in the right balance, that's really the ideal state. And so for us, we measure all three of those. We measure people's sense of autonomy, whether or not they're getting the information they need, and whether or not they're getting the right kinds of collaboration.
So we have a question for Hilda about what behaviors are representing boldness.
Thanks for the layup. So I would say experimentation, willingness to try things and fail and learn from those things. For some employees, it's really just speaking up. And I know that's come up a couple of times this morning, but what we said was, we want you to move from where you are today to a little bolder. Some people are a 1 on a scale of 1 to 10, and some people are an 8. So just step out from where you are a couple of notches. And so I'll leave it at that. Curiosity, creativity.
Yeah, Jamie.
I'm wondering, having to do with that, if anyone has ideas about how to have it not just be the person who needs to lean in and be more bold, but the person who's monopolizing the room or has some narcissism, a touch of narcissism.
I'll take a shot at that. I would say we felt like on the spectrum, we probably swung way more on the I'm not going to speak up end of things, because the answer would often be, oh, we've tried that before, and so people would shut down. And so even though I totally agree with you, there is that risk, we chose not to address that specifically. Now we were speaking to leaders through this whole process and saying, you have to create this environment of openness and safe space for your employees to speak up. So hopefully that means you're not dominating the meeting yourself. And but to your question, I think it is an issue, but not our biggest issue.
So this is to Chantrelle. Can you say more about measuring meeting quality?
Yeah. So it's a hard topic, right, to say exactly whether a meeting was high quality or not. But if you are sending a lot of email or doing chat right while you're in the meeting, I would raise, in my head, the probability that meeting was lower in quality. We've seen some kinds of studies that has said you can't make a decision in a meeting with more than 6 people. It's a number, none of these are hard and fast rules, but directionally, when we're looking across, usually at a company, thousands of people, having probably, a manager and above is usually spending around 20 hours of their 40-hour-ish work week in meetings. More of the meetings that are very large and have a lot of multitasking and start late, and people are double booked for that meeting, and so you don't know whether they're going to show up. Those are, and they were maybe scheduled at the very last minute. It is more likely that those meetings are of low quality, and the quality of the meeting depends on everybody's behavior and attitude and all of the decisions that they're making throughout. So you just, if you can move toward 10% overall higher meeting quality, then you've got a big victory, but you cannot ever probably know, without a shadow of a doubt that your meeting is effective. There's also a lot of, the point about, do you bring the feedback loop to the manager and what you can do with technology versus what's a really good idea? Since so many of our meetings are mediated by Teams or Skype or Zoom or whatever tool we're using, you could record every second of that meeting and run it through a model that said whether you're making decisions or people are being inclusive or how much share of voice do people have or what's the tone of voice or everything. So everyone's really interested in doing that, but to the point of bringing the information back to the manager, it's a really big user experience challenge to have your meeting software tell you that you did a bad job at that meeting or that was a useless meeting or something. So there'll be a lot, you need to have people own the problem, say, I want to have better meetings, and then make some of their own choices about what to do about it and have the technology be their helper versus their uninvited guest.
So let me try to ask this with the proper intonation implied by the question. Mary Kate, Google really doesn't use any cool algorithms to collect or interpret employee data? And people also want to know what the overall, the typical response rate is for your many, many survey moments.
All right, I'll start with the first one. The first one is we really do use some really cool algorithms, but we don't use really cool data. So the ways in which we take the survey feedback and look at that along with sort of the basic employee data, there's so much wealth of modeling techniques that we've used, and we've even both quantitatively, and we also have ethnographers on our team as well. And so we even use plain old reading and looking and watching and understanding and sense-making techniques as well. The response rate piece, I don't think I should disclose the exact number, but it is quite high, and we know that it is above industry standards.
Nice. I'm actually going to throw in a question for Jeremiah that has to do with fit. I think it's a really interesting domain, and having studied fit back in the dark ages, I was always perplexed that the translation of person culture fit was always higher is better. And in fact, the real idea is you need to understand the fit. You need to understand what the ad is, or what the point of divergence is, or what the new version of the portfolio is going to look like when you add another person. And so I guess I'm searching for yours. It looks like you're pushing a sort of next generation that has a more sophisticated way of thinking about fit. And I'm just interested to hear how you all are thinking about various attributes of fit that you put into your sort of set of considerations.
I mean, I think the first component is what you've already published on extensively, which is just separating apart kind of a fit with the current state versus fit with a more aspirational state, which would separate, kind of if you fit with a current, that's going to speed up enculturation and trust and so on, versus if you fit with a future state, you're going to be potentially a change champion or an element of divergence. That's a culture ad. But then I think what becomes more and more critical is that as organizations ask for greater diversity, it elevates the need for inclusiveness and receptivity and the ability to make use of that diversity. So when clients do ask for someone who doesn't fit as a new addition to their culture, then we have to kind of double down on enculturation processes and coaching around that, and a much greater thoughtfulness around how to maximize the benefit of that difference. So I think that's one of the bigger things we're talking about. But the other thing that I would point to is the adaptability of the individuals who are different. So is that individual able to pick up on the difference and know when to exhibit the current attributes of the culture, and know when to pick up on it's time to start shifting things and pushing things, and then use new types of language, use new types of behaviors, and introduce new norms at the right time in the right way.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, Dan.
How do you see the connection between leadership development and culture change? I mean, in the extreme, sometimes they're very disconnected in organizations. Sometimes one group is trying desperately to fill slots and fit is a criteria, while the other, a group in organizational change, culture change, is trying to change those slots. But it can be a very powerful combination where leadership development drives culture change.
Yeah, I think there was an article not too long ago around kind of the failures of leadership development and training, and I think one of the main conclusions was if you don't consider the cultural environment and the climate and the systems, it's doomed to failure. So I think one way to think about it is leadership development as an intervention, as a treatment on the culture, which I think that's what you're pointing out. It's a powerful way. If you're very clear on the kind of culture you want to create, you should be developing leaders to authentically exhibit that future culture. But I think the reverse can also be true, in that the existing culture is a constraint on what you want to develop. So if you're trying to develop new behaviors or mindsets that aren't authentically, kind of supported with either the culture you have or the culture you want to have, there'll be too much resistance to train those new behaviors. So I think that there's a two-way relationship between the two.
Okay. Yeah, Robert.
Chantrelle, I think, had her hand up first, so So let me think about the right way to ask this question. So this conference is mainly perceived as a way for kind of you guys to learn from academics about culture, but it occurred to me... What? Well, okay, dialogue, but we talk a lot about how to change cultures in their settings. I am curious. So in my 8 years at the University of Zurich, we've been trying to change the culture from a hierarchical, kind of very male-oriented, power-oriented, traditional German department. The academic profession is currently trying to change its culture in important ways, dealing with some things that have come up. And I'm curious, maybe for Mary Kate, who spent time in an academic environment, but I don't know if this is really for any of you, knowing that academic contexts have unique features. Everyone was the smartest person in the class and still thinks they are. It's not easy to kind of, hiring and getting rid of people are much different in academic contexts. Do you have any suggestions for us if we're trying to kind of change our departments or our kind of academic organizations in terms of how we might be able to do that?
This is awkward. Okay.
Future of academics is on your shoulder.
Yeah. Well, I'll say I had a perfect experience at Berkeley, so I'm struggling to think of ways it could be improved. Although academics are very, very special and obviously quite smart, they are also human. And so I think everything that we've talked about so far in this conference applies just as equally to an academic setting as it does to a corporate one. Incentives, storytelling, listening, the things we've all covered this morning, I think really just apply just exactly the same in an academic setting. Maybe harder, because I think, what they say is that you can guess how long an institution's going to last by how long it's already lasted. That's the best possible way of predicting. So books are going to be around for a really long time, and cell phones probably less so. But universities have been around for a really, really long time, and so changing education is much harder than changing a corporate system that's been around much shorter and has much quicker fads. So it'll be hard, but I think we know the tools that are needed.
I have an idea. Like, you get sabbaticals in academia, is my understanding, and then it seems like you just go and work in some other college. But why not go work in private industry for a little bit and just see what it's like? Because I hired someone who has been a professor the rest of her life, and she just came and switched. And she's having so much fun, partly because it's all just so different, and she gets to build things, and it's just such a totally different experience. How could you know what it would be like? And also, it would be fun to go be a professor for a year.
So we talked about kind of professional and occupational cultures, but academic institutions have it's a unique kind of bureaucracy. One of the first things that I noticed in joining a professional services firm, which has some of those same dynamics, is that the normal levers don't work quite as well. Like, normally you'd be able to change incentives or have management kind of begin to behave differently. But I think in academic institutions, professional services firms, they don't have the same effect. Like, management can't tell all the academics what to do because the power and the form is most consolidated in the professionals, the autonomous professionals, and the expertise. And so that if you could intervene in the definitions of what's a professional, who do we hire, how are they brought on, what's their professional training before, and the kinds of people we select. And at that level, I think that you have a much greater effect than in in a big corporation, you might change the rules and regulations or the incentives, or you might hire a new kind of leader. But in professional services, you can change the leader, and not much changes. No one really cares about who the CEO is in a professional services firm. And I think that's somewhat similar in academia.
And so I'll just add, not to plug Haas, but Dean Harrison talked a little bit this morning about the defining leader principles at Haas, and actually former Dean Rich Lyons is here in the audience with us today, who is actually the instigator of our overall culture effort all the way back to 2010. And Rich and I actually tried to codify the many things that Rich did as a leader of this organization to try to develop our culture. And we actually wrote 2 cases about it, where we tried a lot of the stuff that we've seen out there in the world, most of which worked and translated pretty well. There were some details that had to be changed because of the nature of the academic incentives, but we're happy to share that case with you if you're at all interested. It was a really interesting journey, and things like this very building are a result of many of those efforts. So it was a great question. Thank you all. Andrea.
Well, first, thank you for sharing some of the things that you guys are doing to change culture. This was sort of a question that I think applies to all of you, so feel free to take it or leave it. As you're introducing these new changes to culture, this new messaging, there's a transition period, and to Hilda's point, like, you can talk about being bold, but then you come back to your work environment and maybe you can't, or managers get feedback to improve and they don't actually do it, or there's a history of a bad culture. How do you deal with the possibility that having these new messages actually makes employees feel more cynical, that there's something that's being said and it's not aligning with reality? How do you cope with that in that transition period?
I'll start, because we definitely face cynicism from places I really didn't expect it. One thing, and I'll give Doug credit for this, is we were really strong from the beginning about don't use bold to reframe what you're already doing. Like, all of a sudden people were saying, oh yeah, I'm being bold. I had Thai food for lunch today. It was like, oh no, please. So I think you kind of have to just stay steadfast on the journey and try to keep that language. Like, we tried to really control, like, corporate communications, that when we were using those words, they really represented the culture that we were trying to drive, and people weren't just pasting it all over and overusing it. I think, it's like any change curve. You're going to have those that are slow adopters or cynics. And in an old school company like Clorox has been for so long, they've seen so many programs come and go that, a lot of people, and not a lot, because I think many of our employees were hungry for this change. But there's definitely a group that said, I'm gonna wait this one out and see what the next one is, and so it's just takes longer for them to see that actually this isn't going away. And we're 3 years in, and our CEO is still talking about bold. And like, I think a meeting, maybe 6 months ago, I counted how many times he said bold in one presentation. It was like 25 or something. So I think we just have to stay steadfast and tell the stories that cement for people, oh, this is real. Does that answer your question?
Anything? No. Kate? We good? Yeah. 3. We have time for one more question. Yeah, Michael.
I have a question. I think, it's prompted by something Jeremy Maya said, but I think it probably applies to everyone as well as to you, Jenny, which is, I sometimes find myself looking at the older literatures on organizational change, which is sort of a separate field from organizational culture and organizational culture change. It's, some of the influential frameworks were like Cotter's 8 Steps to Change, and pretty much every one of the major consulting companies has a minor variant on the nomenclature of that. Some are 7 steps, some are 9 steps, but they're all quite similar, and the model is, it's like a 3 to 5 year process, and a lot of insistence on you need to do this step before you can get to the next step, et cetera, et cetera. And these steps are neither grassroots organic change nor top-down change, because they usually start with the ideals, which is, let's make people unhappy with the status quo and create a vision of where to go as the first step. And then it's sort of like, build a coalition and then make a few changes to get some quick wins so people can see that the train is leaving the station. And then the idea is then people get on the train and then their habits will change. And then they usually at the last step they say, then build it into the culture. And they're kind of vague about like what, a mission statement, I don't know. meaning of that. But how much do you, when you think about organizational change, do you think about those frameworks? And that field has kind of changed because they've been very influenced by agile and user-centered design, and they talk now about accelerated change and perpetual change, and the idea that you're just constantly reacting instead of having change initiatives. So is that kind of framework irrelevant? Is the new version of it relevant? How does that dovetail with organizational culture change?
If I can
You wanna
start,
start?
yeah. I think the first thing is that the way we divide up the study of change is problematic in the sense that if you look at leadership development, or if you look at even like social movements, like you can find a lot around that sounds just like and looks just like culture change, and so like Saul Alinsky stuff on how to push the dominant, like it's culture change. So the first thing I think is to looking across domains and trying to find commonalities, and I think like Ed Cheyne talks about culture change is fundamentally a learning process. And if we kind of back away from culture change as a specific domain and just think about how do we learn new ways of doing things, you see a lot of techniques across those domains. So to me, that's kind of a first thing, is to kind of be eclectic around how we think about change, not just so specific. I think the other thing is that just like people, cultures learn differently, and so to be sensitive, there's not like the 8 rules of change period that like in a very complex, large organization that's very bureaucratic and has 200 years of history, the change process will be very different than a 10-year-old company with a very different kind of people and dynamics. So you'd have to adapt the learning process to the unique nature. And we understand that there's different styles of learning that individuals thrive in. Cultures, I think, are the same. So picking up on how does this culture like to learn, and then customizing your learning and change process based on those distinctions.
I think there's still, I hear people say, well, we see that we should make this big change, but however will we do it? And it's like, just use John Cotter. Like, it's not, most of the basic steps still have to be taken in order to change. But what companies are really getting at, especially if it's not even a software company, but they say they're doing agile, like what they're trying to do is kind of make it so that people can accept more change. So like they're trying to change the laws of physics, which are like, I can only handle so much change. But the economics of tech and of digital mean that you, like the business cycle can move a lot faster, but humans aren't that different, and we still can't handle that much change. So a lot of the companies that I see that are giant companies that say they're doing agile transformation and are have all different ways of defining that, like that's what they're trying to do, but I haven't seen any validation to say that it's definitely going to be possible to change how people work that fast. But at least you have to have them having shared context and understanding, more, and having the tools. Because a lot of time, because one of the other studies that we've got somebody working on is like when you change out the leadership team of a company, does anything actually change at all, like one layer below them? And we still haven't seen the results of that yet either.
I don't know. You asked me my very simple, this will be controversial, my very simple rule, and I'll sound like a pre-Trumpian Republican, which I never sound like a Republican. I live here in Berkeley, but is a balanced budget. To me, the reason most change efforts fail in organizations is that organizations are trying to slide in, asking people to do more, rather making their list longer rather than balancing out the budget and say, we're going to do more bold. And in order to do that, you can do less X.
Yeah.
And so I think, Chantrelle, that's a little bit of what you're getting at, which is, agility is this catch-all for just be better, faster, more, and the discipline that it takes to really think hard about what you're willing to have people trade off on in order to prioritize something else, I think is essential thinking around change in organizations. It's not easy, but conceptually, to me, that's what makes sense. Let me just sum up by saying fantastic. Thank you all. I mean, one thing that I really got from the 4 panelists being juxtaposed together is the importance of the experience of new behaviors, the experience of change, really understanding at a granular level what's happening on the ground. Hilda, you said you wanted the training to feel like you wanted the new culture to be. Mary Kate wants to know what people are thinking about in these critical moments, whether they're deciding to join the organization, whether they're getting promoted, whether they're deciding to leave. Chantrelle is interested in, literally how are you spending your time? And I loved your quick transition from the word meeting to actual collaboration, because when you're meeting in open space, you don't need to have meetings. You're just getting the work done together, which is how it needs to happen. And the idea of, placing people in the context of the organization. So for someone who's much more analytically focused and who rarely actually experiences organizations, right? I just play someone who experiences organizations on TV, right? I think that there's huge validation in the grounding of experience when we're talking about something like culture. We have to understand it at a granular level. What's happening? What are people doing? How are they thinking about it? What are they anticipating the consequences to be? And I think that that's always going to be an essential component of understanding culture. So thank you all.
Thank you.
We're going to move to, let's clap. Okay, so you may not have noticed this, but we actually we ended up pulling out one of our table group discussions because the content was so wonderful, and we let things run. So what we're going to do is use this table group discussion to really serve as a time to talk about the different panelists that we've seen, both this panel plus the Adobe, Deloitte, Genentech, Pixar, and Netflix talks as well. And we have our helpers coming around to bring you a couple of things for your table to help with this conversation. And what we'd like you to do is try to have something kind of tangible come out of the contemplation we've had a chance to go through today. So we have a couple of cues here. One is, what is one action step you could take to apply the learnings from these roundtables in your organization? And that applies to us in academia as well. What are some of the barriers? And what could you do to overcome those barriers? We also want to ask you about a research question that any of these talks have sparked for you. We had lots of answers, but there were also some things that are still in progress. What could we do to learn more about those in systematic ways? And be sure to use, right, you can't segment your knowledge here. Use any knowledge is fair game from any of the last 2 days to think about this. Each table has an assigned table leader, naturally, and those folks will help facilitate the group walking through these questions. So we're going to take until we're going to take about 15 minutes to go through this, and we look forward to hearing what you come up with. Hey, welcome back. Welcome back. So let me interrupt you gently. We're actually, after I check in with you, we're going to go to a break. So if you want to continue your conversation into the break, that's fantastic. I just wanted to check in because I'm so curious to hear what you all came up with in terms of these questions. Anyone want to take a shot at representing what your table came up with for any of the questions that we have on the board here? What were some of the themes that you talked about, some of the issues you came up with? Rich.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to jump to the research questions. There were neat things that came up in all of those, but I think it was the Pixar point of what happens when we codify. What is the impact of codifying per se? That's just such a neat question, and that was mentioned here at the table. And also this notion of the link between compressed schedules and limitations on innovation. It seems like we have the kind of data now and analytics to maybe put some structure to that question as well as researchers. And there were others, but those two were wonderful.
Super interesting. Thank you. Others? Any of these? Yeah, please.
Hi. So I'll go through a few of the items that we had, but one of the things that surprised us the most was not having that programmatic plan for your culture, not having the future state completely defined. And we struggled a bit with that, like, well, would that work? And do you at least have to know that you're headed in this direction, and what happens if everyone else is headed in that direction? So how far do you define it? And it would be an interesting research question to see if the waterfall method of truly defining out and planning everything out in a program versus taking more of an agile, iterative approach to your culture and kind of more organically saying, well, we're headed sort of here, and just seeing what the results are from there. So that was a surprise in our research. And then we had some very solid next steps about really holding the leaders accountable for modeling and talking through. There was some great discussion here about sharing with the different cultures that are at our table about how you might hold leaders accountable. If there's a culture of humility or a culture of whatnot, then how could you do that?
Fascinating. Yeah, Martin.
We discussed culture change and the challenge that it seems like the culture is very slow to change and everything else around it is changing much faster in a change effort. The innovation, the engagement, the leadership, the strategy, the products, and so on. And so we didn't come up with an answer because we run out of time, but anyone on the table has saw that as a huge problem. So it's a great research question. What do you do if the culture is lagging in its change? Do you speed it up or do you manage it otherwise? And also for practitioners, how do you actually, in a change effort, how do you cope with that? So we left it as a question to be answered.
Yeah. Great. Kind of the asynchrony of the pace. Please. He's coming here. No, here. Here.
Yeah, so we talked about a lot of issues, but most of our discussions focus around the role of leadership in organizational transformation. And we talked about whether it's realistic to expect the leaders that are coming from within the organization to change the organization, because there's the notion of authenticity of that change. How do you believe somebody who you've seen for the last 10 years doing the same thing all over again to actually transform the culture? We talked about the role of leadership development programs. We talked also about this common thread of storytelling, and about the consistency between the stories that the organization tells, but also whether it's aligned with other systems of the organization.
So we'll just add to that. We talked also about the storytelling a little bit, and the need to make sure that you're telling stories about particular characteristics or behaviors that are successes as well as those that are failures, to allow people to exhibit the behavior even if it results in failure, and to talk about what that means. Otherwise, there's still this notion of, okay, it's great to talk about boldness if I'm successful. What about if I'm bold and I get shot? Then what? We also talked a little bit about what's the first step or the first action you take. And we got sort of fixated in the academic climate that if you're not tenured, maybe the first step is to sit in a corner and not say anything so that you can still get your tenure. But then, what are the barriers? It's finding the right levers in a system that's very complex to push or to pull to try and get change to be affected in that culture.
Yeah, interesting. So the storytelling theme, I think, is coming through really loud and clear. And I guess on the psychological side, we think a lot about making meaning, creating meaning. And so the expectation that a story could be told and sit there and be interpreted the way you're intending it for it to be interpreted is probably something close to a myth. So in some ways, I always like to think about leaders as curators of stories, that you're actually highlighting the stories and helping to infuse them into the system, knowing that they're always going to bend and turn in certain ways, but that the themes somehow can come out. I think Jay was probably meaning some of that too, if he's still here. Maybe he had to go back. He had to go back because they have the strategy conference that starts tomorrow where they hand out ski tickets. I know, I'm sorry. We do have chocolate and M&Ms, but no ski tickets. I think I saw, we'll do one more hand I saw somewhere. Yeah, please.
So we had a lot of the similar things that were already discussed, but maybe one addition was an insight that having a meeting doesn't mean that we're collaborative. And so then really researching what are actually the items of collaboration and to look at the organization to kind of evaluate that. Then along the lines of Rich's comment, so if we have a list of values, we might actually create the cynicism for culture change and do the opposite of what we're intending to do. And so research along the lines of what happens to the organizations that do codify their values. Yeah. Are they getting the culture change that they're after or not? And then an organizational change or action item rather, how can we be more clear where leaders inhibit speaking up and really eliminating psychological safety and really pinpointing those points in the organizations where leaders fail in this way. So
great. Awesome. Wow, you're learning stuff. That's amazing. Fantastic. Okay, we have our last break of the day and then two fantastic sessions that will round out our day today. So back at 3:30, we'll have a research session and then another a plenary session and then a panel. And then we'll have some wine and we'll call it a day. So 15 minutes. Thank you.